Welcome to The Whole View. I'm Stacy Toth of Real Everything, and I'm here each week to dive deeper into how we can find happiness and health inside and out through self-love, body positivity, and discovering new ways to be our best selves. Before we get started, a reminder that this podcast is for general educational purposes and not intended to diagnose, advise, or treat any physical or mental illness, and we always recommend that you see a licensed health professional accordingly. And I'm excited to welcome today Jenn Trepeck, an optimal health coach and podcaster. So not your medical professional for advice today, but we're going to be giving lots of references and information, and as always, empowering you with information to look more into some of the things that we'll be talking about. Jenn was influenced by growing up in a diet culture home, and Jenn's work focuses on the nutrition education we're all supposed to know, but no one really ever told us. And I think listeners, you'd be familiar with concepts like BMI being BS or alcohol being a limiting factor for health and other topics that we lean into here that oftentimes don't win us any popularity awards, but facts are facts. So there we are. And Jenn is on a mission to pay it forward and help people help themselves. After a decade of working with clients, Jenn started Salad with a Side of Fries podcast, which, by the way, I love because I've actually ordered that many times.
Of course you have.
Of course. And based on science, yet lighthearted, Jenn talks about living life while still making ourselves and our health a priority. And I want to welcome you to the show, Jenn. Love lots of the topics that you focus on. Maybe we can even throw in some of the why keto isn't the answer shade into some of our conversation today, but that's not the topic we're going for. I love that we can remind people to nourish themselves and all the things while also educating on how we can help them. Before we get started, maybe you could tell us just a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah. Thanks. First of all, Stacy, thank you for having me. I'm excited for our conversation. And for everybody, I am that person who watched people have this challenge of weight and diet and following a million things. And then I was that person. So backing up, I grew up a dancer, and I was that person that we all roll our eyes at now, where no matter what they put on, it looks good. That was me as a kid. So between that and being a dancer, I was so aware of my body that when I started to gain weight, I think I was hypersensitive to it. And I remember being in the store with my mom and my sister and crying about the clothes, the size of the clothes that actually fit and looked good. And I thought when I started to gain weight, I was like, okay, I know what to do because I watched everybody do this my whole life. And I tried every diet under the sun. I joke that there isn't a diet out there that I haven't done, my family hasn't done, or we don't know somebody who's tried it. And it was I lived on that roller coaster, and I thought, that's what it is, right? There was maybe that genetic anomaly who didn't live on the up and down, but everybody else did. And once this was a thing, it was always going to be a thing in my life. And worlds collided for me because I graduated from undergrad, moved to New York, and shortly after, I was I don't know what I'm going to do. I just know I'm not going to work for somebody else for the rest of my life. But I didn't have the answer of what that was going to be. And when I learned about the curriculum that I based my practice on, and it completely changed my life, I was this is my thing, right? This is what I'm going to do outside of my full-time job to either make extra money and retire early or just work for myself. And that's really what happened. But I built my practice, health coaching on the side for 12 years. July of 2019, I left my full-time job, launched my podcast, Salad with a Side of Fries, more because I didn't know what to do with free time. And here we are, over 5 years later, and I get to sit here and talk to you and support your community, and I'm so excited about it. But as you said in introducing me, I felt like this information was the nutrition education we're all supposed to know and no one ever taught us. And then I started to ask questions of like, why isn't that what we learned? And how did all of those things come to be? And fundamentally, the information shifted all of these food decisions from being emotional to intellectual. And it completely shifted my dynamic with food, shifted my dynamic with myself and my body, and allowed me also to understand that I hadn't failed. All of you have not failed. All of these things that we've tried have failed us. And it's reclaiming our power, reclaiming our control over our health and our well-being, both in body and mind and in all the ways in our lives.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And one of the things that you mentioned that it comes up for me is this idea of being intellectual versus emotional. And I do want to kind of like pause and hold space for some of these things through the journey might still be emotional, and that's okay. Also, I think it's that awareness of knowing that, like, in this moment, this is why I'm making these choices. Not everything that you're going to put in your mouth, for example, a side of fries, is going to be for the purpose of optimizing your health. Your wellness also is a mental health journey. And we're going to talk a little bit about that side of it today when it comes to mood and willpower and different kinds of things that affect the choices that we're making because it's not in a vacuum. My husband has joked for years that if there was a product in the market that he could take that would just be like one thing, like a drink or whatever, and he could consume that one thing for the rest of his life and take all the decision making out of food, like he would do it. I am the polar opposite because he's like, I don't want to have to think about it. I don't want to have to think about my nutrients. I don't want to like whatever. I just want a simple solution. And me, on the other hand, I'm like, I love the flavors of food, the experience of food, the socialness of food, like the all of the things that go into the culture that is built around our experience with food, where we live even drives what is available locally at that time and in season and all of these things. And I like to experience all of the seasons. I like to experience all those
Yeah.
things, right?
Well, and that's a piece too. Part of the emotional side is beating ourselves up. And if we think or believe that eating for a non-hunger purpose is a failure, it is just as detrimental to our health as potentially only ever eating Oreos, right? That there's a piece of this to understand there isn't a culture in the world that doesn't use food in some way for celebration, for connection, for grief, right? Like food is inextricably linked to culture and connection. And that's not a problem either. But we can feel like it's a problem because maybe we're challenged in that dynamic or we've been told for so long that if you eat for any other reason than nourishment and health, P.S., I would argue that all of that is nourishment and health in a different way. But like we've been told these things that have led us to these beliefs that are fundamentally not hopeful
Yeah.
and not true.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. So let's dig in a little bit to this idea that there are much bigger things impacting our health and wellness than just exactly what's on our plate, right? That there are foods, whether how we consume them, when we consume them, affects just as much as like what we're consuming as it relates to our mood and our drive and desire to then crave other things that follow. And I can talk about my own experiences but I think we all have our own. And accordingly, how that all affects our willpower, right? Like it's a huge can of worms. So let's start at the beginning in terms of how those topics, not just exactly what is recommended, which you'd get if you asked 5 people, you'd get 6 different answers on what is the ideal foods to consume, but all of these other factors that go into our health and wellness as it relates to the foods that we're eating, which is obviously not in a vacuum either, right? There's a lot of other things that affect our health, but how did these topics come up as a priority for your coaching practice?
I'm an insatiable student, probably like to a fault, right? And whether it was things that I had learned for myself or things that were coming up for my clients, like we don't need another person in the world to tell us to eat a cucumber over a Twix. Like, duh, right? But there are times where that's an easier decision than others. And why is that? And how can we create a situation such that choosing the cucumber over the Twix is the easiest in most situations, right? And how can we then also choose the Twix and have it not impact us the same way it might right now, right? And so I dug into, why is this the case? Like, I really believe the difference between knowing what to do and actually doing it is understanding why, right? I don't use the word should for that reason, right? Nobody needs more shoulds in their life, right? What we need to do is understand why that's a recommendation. And then we get to make choices rather than living in that push and pull of, I know I should do this, but why do I suck and do the other thing, right? Like, that's not productive. So in looking at and researching why for all of these things, there's a lot of elements at play physiologically. So I'm trying to think about where to start, because willpower, food and mood, and then also hunger all could be their own episodes individually. So let's start with understanding that we have hormones, right? Hormones control all of these things. Most of the time we think of hormones, we think of like the reproductive hormones or our sex hormones, right? A lot of times, especially now, we know a lot about insulin as a hormone, right? When we are insulin resistant, that's type 2 diabetes. Well, there are also hormones that tell us when we're hungry and tell us when we're satisfied. They are called ghrelin and leptin. We can become resistant to those hormones also. So if you ever feel like you're not hungry all day or most of the time, and then you see food and realize you're hungry, and then you start eating and you can't stop, right? Those are signs of leptin and ghrelin resistance. If we tend to crave a lot of the salty, crunchy snacks, that is often connected to leptin resistance. If we are constantly craving sugar, it is a sign of leptin resistance. So there's a lot of elements at play here that are physiological. And we've also heard like the gut-brain connection. So there's a literal nerve, cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, that connects the gut and the brain. Here's what's really important to understand about the vagus nerve. Think of it like a 5-lane highway, right? You're driving down the street, there's 5 lanes of traffic going. 3 of those lanes go gut to brain. 2 lanes go brain to gut. So what that tells us is that we will never outthink the biochemistry of what we are feeding our bodies. So if it has felt for you like it at one time felt for me, like making the healthful choice was like somebody asking you to climb Mount Everest naked and barefoot, you're not alone, and it is very chemical. And oftentimes it's a function of the nutrients that we are providing ourselves or the lack of nutrients that we're providing ourselves. And by the way, I'm not even like, this is all not even talking about processed foods and how they are specifically formulated to not trigger satiety in the stomach or the brain, and at the same time, trigger all the right taste buds and all the right brain receptors to have us keep eating them, right? So there's a lot of elements that play. When we think about food and mood, we want to think about how we are fueling ourselves to create the chemistry for a healthy, positive, energetic mood, right? Sometimes the way to think about creating something, it's helpful to think about the opposite, right? What creates the opposite? What creates or disrupts our mood and our energy? So sensory overload is a big one. We're talking about right now things that create neurotransmitter imbalance, right? So sensory overload. I don't know about you. This is one that I am still working, right? But I have my phone, the TV, maybe the computer, a million things going at once, scrolling social media, right? We are in a world of sensory overload. As we talked about a minute ago, dietary choices can create neurotransmitter imbalance, including processed foods or lack of nutrient. Stress, right? Chronic stress. Whether we realize it or not, our body is having a physiological response to stress all the time because our body's physiological stress response was not designed for our modern world and modern stressors. Also, that could be a whole other episode. Toxins, both in terms of things that we consume, like alcohol, as you mentioned before, or what's in our environment, from the air we breathe to the products we use to things that are like off-gassing from our couch, right? All of these toxins create a burden on the body that can disrupt our neurotransmitter function and even bowel dysregulation, right? Because again, we have this gut-brain connection. So the long and the short of it is we want to create an environment inside the body for health and cognitive health. We do that by focusing on nutrients, managing blood sugar, building lean muscle mass, deep breathing so that we have oxygen, right? Some of the most powerful nutrients, according to the research, for our cognitive health and our mood, omega-3 fatty acids. Your brain is made up mostly of omega-3s. And the average American is really out of balance in the omega-3s and omega-6s. And that creates inflammation. Now, inflammation also challenges our cognitive health and our cognitive function. So antioxidants that can help water on the house fire, right? It's like we want antioxidants to be the fire hose of water onto the house fire of inflammation. Minerals are critically important. Magnesium, especially. CoQ10, so coenzyme Q10, is like the fuel for our mitochondria. Okay, so 7th grade science, we have a cell. Mitochondria are the powerhouse, the energy of the cell, right? What feeds mitochondria is coenzyme Q10. So if we are deficient, and by the way, if you or you know anyone who is on a statin drug for cholesterol, the body's production of cholesterol and the body's own production of coenzyme Q10 are the same pathway. So if we block the body's production of cholesterol, we block the body's production of CoQ10. So this might make the argument for a greater level of commitment to some supplementation or things like that.
Can I just
Yes.
You're saying
Yes.
lots of great things, but there's a couple of things that I want to dig into a little bit before we
Great.
go further. So first of all, when you use the word processed food, I associate that with diet culture. So I want to define what you mean, which I believe is nutrient deficient foods that are higher in calories, right? So you're getting calories from food, but you're not getting nutrients from food is probably the bucket of foods that you're referring to as processed.
They may not even be higher in calories, but they are fundamentally foods that are devoid of nutrition.
Okay.
If we
Because,
read, like if we read the ingredients, they are the things where it's mostly a bunch of words that we're not really sure what they mean.
well, so this is where I want to challenge a little bit because I, for example, have seen improvement in my health from protein powders, both from the
Yes.
perspective of adding more protein as a woman who is not getting any younger and giving myself nourishment in the morning to really like start my day. It helps my body say, oh, this is what feels good versus grabbing something quick and carby in the morning does not set me personally up for success. However, protein powder, by definition, mine and others, have ingredients in them that are non pronounceable and by definition are very processed. Like protein powder
So
is a
so
very
there's a
processed food.
distinction. Not all protein powders are as highly processed as you're making it sound, I think. There are a lot of very clean, very healthful, nutritious options. And you have that in any and every category. So when I use the word, it's not about saying everything like this is a problem. It's about us being able to understand what the difference ingredients are, what the difference in ingredients are, what are they giving us or not giving us, and sometimes what purpose they serve. Because with that said, there are certain times where, especially, I do a lot of work in my practice with supplementation. And there are certain times where the higher quality, better ingredient is not the one that was grown in the wild, but the one that was grown in a lab. And there are certain people who would define that as a problem. So I think it's really important, to your point, that we take a broader perspective and recognize that, like, frankly, nothing is a simple yes, no. Everything exists on a spectrum, and it's all just about the choices that we make. So I'm a big fan of a lot of protein powders and protein bars and packaged foods. There are also a lot of products out there in those same categories that I'm not a big fan of. And so it comes down to the nuances and the details of each individual one.
Yeah. And I wanted to point that out because I feel like when we broadly demonize a word like processed food, that it can sometimes have implications that are unintended. And for quite a number of people, especially in the anti-diet culture movement, we use broad words like that, then it can kind of like be twisted around, not in a malicious sort of way, but to challenge us to say, well, wait a minute, you're saying protein powders and protein bars and supplements are good. How do those get made in a factory? And I also always want to leave grace and space for people who don't have access to, for example, all of the opportunities for the highest quality of everything wherever they might be or whatever their finances might allow. And therefore, there is plenty of opportunity when we're talking about wellness to have improvement,
Yeah.
customization without it being like you need the highest of the highest of the high over here. And I think because there is such
It's 1,000% not required. Perfection, not required. Extremes, any extreme, right? Whether it's in the, like I joke, like salad with a side of fries, and people are like, well, what do you mean by that? And it's like, we call it wellness without the weirdness, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you to only eat things that are green and that the fries are the problem. Like, no, right? Everything, it's about understanding how all the puzzle pieces fit together. And so if we're living in a place of perfection, or only choosing nutrient deficient, calorie dense foods, right? Either extreme isn't serving us. And I think that's, to your point, like a really helpful distinction, because it's for the same reason that I teach people to remove the word cheat from their vocabulary. Like nothing is cheating, right? Like everything, I don't even get where that became a thing, because it creates this idea of like there are on days and there are off days. And that is just as black and white of thinking, right? And the body doesn't function well in that black and white extremes compared to how it functions in the middle and the gray area where we have things all the time.
It's ironic because as you talk about cheat days and where it comes from, I immediately think of The Rock, who has a designated day for that. And people look to The Rock as this peak health person. And ironically, BMI defines him as morbidly obese, right? And so
Right.
it's like this that I don't have a point to make other than to bring you full circle to say none of it makes sense. Like, let's just set it
Right.
all aside. None of it makes sense. Okay, so let's dig into a little bit about where I think you're going with this as you're digging into some of the things you mentioned. Omega-3, CoQ10, some of the other chemical connections related to food and mood. I think that it is broadly under un, un understood. That's not what I wanted to say, but I don't think that it's well understood how much nutrient deficiency affects our moods and our overall mental well-being, which obviously plays into, as we were talking about earlier in the show, the choices that we make towards our overall wellness long term. You were talking about ghrelin, and at the same time, there are a lot of other things that feed into where we're going to with all of this, which is willpower. So, can we talk a little bit about some of those other common chemical connections related to our mood that if we are probably deficient with in our food? I know you talk about supplements. I'm a big proponent of testing for deficiencies because I think a lot of people don't realize that they're deficient and how many, more than half of us, are deficient in multiple different vitamins and minerals. And so, what does that do to our overall wellness as it relates to mood and what drives us motivationally and that sort of thing?
Yeah, everything in the body is connected, right? If we want to think about like even one hormone or neurotransmitter, right? We can look at, so there's something called BDNF, or brain derived neurotrophic factor, right? If we get insufficient omega 3s, more saturated fats that may come from more food, consuming more foods that are naturally higher in saturated fat, or consuming foods where those fats have been added in. If we are increasingly eating refined foods, right? So refined grains versus whole grains, those, right, nutrient deficiencies can create a decrease in brain-derived neurotrophic factor. What we see is that lower levels of BDNF are connected to anxiety and depression, cognitive decline, and metabolic disorders. So fundamentally, it is all connected. And I think the expectation that we will be able to perform, that our body will function, that our brain will function, that we can do all the things that we want to do in the world and show up for all the people that we want to show up for in the world without the proper input, is setting us up for frustration, right? Like if you take your vehicle and you put you put paint in the gas tank, it wouldn't run. And you'd be like, well, duh, right? And I think sometimes we do that with our bodies. We have this expectation that it will function. And really, if we aren't giving the building blocks of the neurotransmitters, if we aren't giving our body the things that it needs, like amino acids and B vitamins and some of these things, then it's like putting paint in the gas tank, and it leaves us really frustrated. So choosing foods that will support nutrient density and our bodies, even optimal might be the next level, right? Like if we think about health on a spectrum of like -10 to +10, like there is tremendous value in getting to 0 if we're living somewhere in like the -4, right? So if we're waking up and it's all we can do to like pry our eyes open and peel ourselves out of bed, then like getting from a -4 to a -2 is tremendous and adds a lot of value. And we can do that through some choices that maybe don't necessarily feel like I keep wanting to say uproot the apple cart, but that's not whatever the phrase is.
The turnover.
So
Yeah.
yeah, whatever, tipping or whatever. Anyway, so thinking about things that support healthy brain chemistry, alpha lipoic acid, so ALA, right? Think about things like spinach and broccoli and yams and tomatoes and Brussels sprouts and carrots and beets. Even red meat. Like red meat's gotten a really bad reputation over the years. I think, as we were talking about with the protein powders, to me, it's the quality of the red meat, it's the quality of the protein powder. And if we can move in the direction of progress, right? Like even if it's, I want to take back even, right? Incremental progress is progress and incredibly valuable. And by the way, I'm a big fan of incremental progress because we can stick with incremental progress and then build on it. When we try to go from like living in one extreme to expecting ourselves to live in another, we set ourselves up for something that's really short-lived, right? So, okay, alpha lipoic acid. We talked about antioxidants before. So think about antioxidants like locks and keys. Okay, so there isn't a single key that's going to fit every lock on the planet. The same thing with the body. We want lots of different antioxidants to fit into all of the different locks in the body, right? Different keys for different locks. So think of the more things you can eat that are colorful and deep colors, the more antioxidants those foods tend to have. By the way, vitamin C has been shown to promote the regulation of like synapses in the brain and the synaptic efficiency of dopamine and glutamic acid. So those are some of the neurotransmitters. And we have so many neurotransmitters that we want to be firing, right? We talked about CoQ10. So CoQ10 might be a supplement. It might be whole grains. It might be salmon or tuna or nobody's favorite, liver and organ meats, right?
I take a
Being
dehydrated liver pill, and
a lot of people do, yeah.
I stand by that is the extent to which I can go. I had my liver phase where I tried to pretend that making liver mousse and eating it
Oh,
with apples was a wonderful thing, and I am so sorry for the lies that I told, because it's not. It's just not.
and we
Think
don't
if you're raised on it and you enjoy it, like, great, but those
totally.
people that don't develop a taste for it, it's so hard to do it later. But it is so
Yeah, we don't
like
have
rich.
to do every single thing that I'm saying, right? Like, I'm throwing out a lot because the things that work for me might not be the same things that work for you, Stacy.
Yeah. I think for me, I have MTHFR, and the one that I really
Yep.
want people to focus on and think about, you haven't mentioned yet, I'm sure you would get there, are B vitamins. So
Yes.
specifically, I have a neurodiverse house. I have a child with PTSD and bipolar, and that like necessity to be nutrient sufficient in B12 is very, very high, because B12 is linked to specifically anxiety, depression, irritability, insomnia, which drives so many other things, and also has a propensity to increase mood swing. If you're deficient in it, increase mood swings, paranoia, irritability, confusion, dementia, hallucinations, and mania if
Yes.
you are bipolar. So it is also linked to thyroid health, right? So if your thyroid isn't functioning great, then it's going to affect your moods and all of the things that I just mentioned. So we want to be nourishing for thyroid health. We want to be making sure that we're vitamin B deficient. There's lots of different vitamin Bs, but B12 and
So,
thiamine are the ones that I would like tell people to lean in real heavy on.
well, there's some nuance to that, right? So let me back up for a second. So NTHFR is a genetic variation in our methylation pathways. And what that is, so methylation is a very long multi-step process in the body of converting something that we get or take or eat into the usable form. Okay? Genetically, this MTHFR, right? There's a genetic variation that actually a majority of the population has, where we biologically, chemically, genetically can't go all the way through all of those steps. And B vitamins all need to be present for any of them to work properly. So we actually don't necessarily want to go all in on a B12 or all in on a thiamine supplement on their own. What we really want to look for is a B complex that uses the activated or methylated form of the vitamin. So we want to look at those ingredients and we're looking for methylcobalamin, right? We're looking for methyl tetrahydrofolate. Don't make me say it again.
With certain things, when you see them on the label, you're like, what is that? Right? Tocopherol. What is that? Is that a bad thing? No, that's vitamin E, right? Like, this is where I think when we say that there are things that are unpronounceable on a label or an ingredient, it can be like a little bit alarmist when we don't need it to be. And
which is why education and working with somebody who can help make those distinctions, like, again, the expectation that we're going to know those things on our own when no one has ever really taught us these things is part of what sets us up. And by the way, like, we can also get B vitamins through our food and through our nutrition choices. And if we have the MTHFR variant, we can still get some of what we need from that, but the conversion, right, to getting the full value of everything from those is limited. So,
which is where, no, it's why I recommend that people test for those things. You can do blood tests with your doctors. There are also like pea stick tests that you can do at home for different types of vitamins. And I think for me, vitamin C is one of the ones that I need to be watchful of. And that's an easy one to do at home because the more stressed you are, the more vitamin C your body is using, and you want it to
B vitamins too,
as well, and magnesium, right? So your body leans into a couple of things depending on where you are in your life, and so you might be a year ago nutrient sufficient in all of these things, but let's say you change your jobs, or you have a child, or you move your house, or you just go through a stressful period. Your body could start to use nutrients in a very different way, and it also is dependent on how you're fueling and nourishing yourself. It could also be dependent on what cycle of life that you're in. I've done a lot of educating on perimenopause lately because that's the cycle of life that I'm in, and my body is doing things differently. I'm not a fan. Hard pass, but can't control it myself, right? And so my body needs different things in this phase of life than it needed earlier. The other common deficiency that is very mood related that I want to make sure we don't skip is vitamin D, because
I was just going to bring up vitamin D. Yeah.
Because most people are deficient in vitamin D, and it is well known that that is a mood disorder link. If you hear about, for example, seasonal affective disorder, that is in most cases directly related to sunlight and vitamin D because, for example, my husband, who's a postal carrier, he's outside, he's delivering the mail, he's getting sunlight during the summer. He is literally skipping along like jolly and joyful in the summertime, and he is a completely different person in the winter. without that same amount of sunlight and vitamin D. And he is someone who really needs to supplement vitamin D in the wintertime because of seasonal affective disorder. But it's not just seasonally that we see vitamin D affecting our mood.
Yeah. So a couple things on vitamin D. So every cell in your body has a vitamin D receptor. Now, for all the real science nerds, you're right. Red blood cells are transient. They don't have vitamin D receptors, but every other cell in your body has a vitamin D receptor site. And if we acknowledge, which I think everybody here does, if we acknowledge that the body knows what to do, and all the time, while it might be triaging, the body always does what it needs to do as it's designed. So if something isn't functioning, quote unquote, properly, there's a reason that the body has compensated in that way. But the body's compensating because that's what it's supposed to do, right? Our job is to help figure out what's creating the need for the body to compensate. So with that said, our body believes vitamin D is so important that it can produce it on its own. Like, let's just take a minute to acknowledge, right? Something that critical wouldn't necessarily, right? Like, the body can produce it. Now, it can only produce it if it has the proper building blocks. And that's what you're talking about with seasonal affective disorder. But the other thing that I want to point out to everybody is that our modern lives block our ability to absorb the sunlight that we need, the actual rays. So sunblock is going to block it. Not having enough oil in your skin is going to block it, right? You can absorb without enough oil. We can't take the sunlight and convert it in the skin. Well, our modern lives where we shower and we use soaps and things and then lotions and whatever, like, yep, we are inhibiting our body's ability to take the sunlight and turn it into usable vitamin D. And again, people who have challenges with MTHFR, right? If we have challenges with methylation, we have challenges getting the D into the form that the body can use. And because we need D in so many places, most people end up deficient. So vitamin D used to be talked about in terms and measured in IUs, international units. Now everybody's shifted into mics or micrograms. So with the doctors that I work with and my clients, we recommend 125 micrograms of vitamin D3 daily. And we also want to help the body absorb all of that and get the D into the bone and into the cell and into the brain and all the places where we need it. So vitamin D3 with K2 helps us use that vitamin D. So when it comes to supplementation, it makes the argument for working with somebody who understands some of these things because there's a piece of bioavailability in terms of the quality of the ingredients and then also bioactivity, like the methylated form of the B vitamins or D3 with K2 so that we get the bioactivity of the D3 and those kinds of things. So
And do you
it
think
makes
I do think that medical professionals are becoming more aware. I think for a
yes.
long time it was vitamin D was more of a niche kind of topic, or MTHFR was more of niche. I do think that it's better understood now. I know our kind of mainstream primary care professional, which we chose because they run extensive labs. So they're not extremely niche, but they're not a functional medicine doctor. They're not something like that. They run annual vitamin D blood work, and
Yep.
then they do a prescription. Like you can, most people need to take vitamin D supplementation, period. It's just, we do not live lives in the sun the way that our bodies were originally evolved to do. And you can also, most people need like a plus up prescription that is actually prescribed by a doctor for like a week long I think for me, it was like 6 weeks. Like you take one pill 1 week for 6 weeks or something like that to
Yeah.
plus up. And so, especially as we're going into these darker seasons, right? It might be worth looking into that. And again, your levels will change over time. So for me, I usually do that blood work in the early fall, have that prescription as I'm going into the winter so that my body gets that plus up, knowing that 6 months from then it's the summertime and I am going to get more sun exposure and make my own vitamin D to not need that plus up as much. But it is really important to measure your vitamin D because it is one of the few vitamins that you can overdose on for negative effects. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing, you're testing at some point to make sure that your body is at the level that it should be. Because if you have too much vitamin D, that can also be a problem.
Right. So I want to talk about D versus B and C and some of these things, because the only nutrients where you can end up in a toxic level in the body are fat soluble vitamins. A, D, E, and K are your only fat soluble vitamins. So those are the ones where we potentially have that challenge. Now, most people are so deficient in D that generally we don't need to worry about it. But with that said, that is why, because D is fat soluble, your body will hold on to it. That's why they can give you a higher dose once a week rather than taking a lower dose daily, right? We can see how that would work compared to your antioxidants, your polyphenols and vitamin C and B vitamins that are water soluble, right? Magnesium, all of these things that we use that are water soluble. If we don't use it when we take it, we will pee it out. It is not hanging on in the body. So it makes the
You can
argument for
see when you take too much vitamin
Oh,
C
yeah.
because your pee gets orange. And it's like
Right.
your
Well,
body's
and
like, nope, don't need that. Here you go.
well, B vitamins, even when you absorb them, B vitamins will turn your pee like neon yellow. I was dating a guy once, and I take a mix of things in the morning, and I gave him some. And he went to go play golf with his dad and like called me, and he was like, "What did you give me?" He's like, "This might be a little graphic for us." Like we were like early on. He was like, "This might be a little graphic, but like my pee is fluorescent." And I was like, "Oh yeah, that you're fine. That happens. It's just the B vitamins. Like don't freak out." He's also a bit of a hypochondriac, so it was just really funny. I should have warned him.
I think when our bodies are nutrient sufficient, whether we're peeing neon yellow or not, right? Like, so we've talked a lot about whether we're getting these things from food, whether we're getting these things from supplementation, it helps our body then feel more nourished is the word that I like to use because that's what it literally feels like to me. So I have a daily smoothie I mentioned with my protein powder. It has 24 vitamins and minerals in it. And I can literally feel the difference on the days that I take or don't take the smoothie because I feel like my body is talking to me if I don't take it and telling me, you need nourishment. You need what you don't have, what I'm used to, what I want to fuel myself, right? My car is literally saying, do not put in my gas tank, right? I want the gasoline. But the problem that I have found with myself, and I'm gonna share this because I know I'm not alone in this, is that from a lifetime of dieting and being in a larger body, I was under the impression that I needed to try to cut food as much as possible. That I was doing the good girl thing in eating less and eating less often. And what it prevented me from doing was seeing what was directly in front of my face, which was that when I didn't do those things, when I didn't nourish myself, when I didn't eat and nourish and love my body and also provide enough nourishment to my body, that it caused this lack of willpower, we'll say. But really, what it was, and we can see this from, I don't know if you're familiar with the Minnesota starvation diet, but I like to quote that a lot because it was healthy adult men, psychological and physical, who were basically put on a diet and then had all of these extreme negative reactions, preoccupation with food, all kinds of things that we can describe of ourselves if we go through this diet culture. And so I would oftentimes skip breakfast and just have a coffee or something, try to push through as long as I could. And then all of a sudden it was 2 or 3 o'clock and my body is in starvation mode and is now looking for every and anything it could possibly find. It no longer cares about nourishment. It no longer wants anything. It's like, give me what I need to survive. Even paint in the engine is fine. And I think that this idea of willpower, when I think of dieting, I immediately go to that place in my head. And I'm like, well, what are they eating beforehand? How are they nourishing and loving on their body beforehand? And this idea that, like, oh, well, if you had willpower, it wouldn't be a problem. It goes back to the original conversation that we were having about ghrelin and these different kinds of things. You literally can't feel what somebody else's body can feel. So, can we talk a little bit about how all of this kind of like comes together?
Yeah. And so backing up for a second, that the situation you're describing is textbook low blood sugar, right? It is what happens when we have low blood sugar. And so willpower is also very chemical. So I think fundamentally to understand willpower, let's just be on the same page about what it is, because I think it gets used in a lot of situations, right? Fundamentally, and according to how the body functions, willpower is decision making. Willpower is self-control. Willpower is our ability to make decisions about long-term desire. So like delayed gratification. We use it any and every time we control a thought, we control an emotion, we control an impulse, our performance. Anytime we exert any self-control, physical or mental, we use our willpower. And every piece of our lives drinks from the 1 cup of willpower. So we only I like to think of willpower as like a refillable cup, right? So what that means is there's a finite amount. Everybody has 1 cup, and it's that same stock of willpower that we use for every area of our life. So I find it really helpful to understand all the things that deplete our willpower. And there are a lot of researchers who will say the only way to replenish willpower is to sleep, which is why, by the way, for everybody who finds that breakfast is way simpler to make healthful choices than dinner and after, it's chemical, right? That willpower cup is full in the morning, right? And typically for most people, by the end of the day, it is the opposite of full. So so there's a lot of researchers who used to say that you get that 1 cup, the only way to refill it is sleep. But from all the research I've done and looked at and all the books that I've read, there are things that replenish our willpower. And if we can create habits and routines that include those things that replenish our willpower, it allows us to have some at different times of the day, right? So let's go through a few of the things first that deplete our willpower. So we talked about already, anytime we make a decision, anytime we resist desire, it's using our willpower. And by the way, that includes both our like conscious resisting desire and the like subconscious resisting desire. So that might look like you're driving down the street, you're taking your kids to school, and you're passing a restaurant that you go to often on the way there. Whether you cognitively acknowledge the fact that there's that restaurant or not, if you're like your eyes subconsciously see the sign and the choice of not stopping, right? The subconscious choice to not stop there drinks from our willpower cup. So recognize it's also not a coincidence that if there's cookies in the kitchen in the office, the first time we walk in there, we can like talk ourselves through ignoring them. But by the fourth or fifth time or later in the day, we end up just eating a piece of the cookie, right? It is chemical. It is not a moral failing, right? Because stress also depletes our willpower. In all irony, multitasking depletes our willpower. So for all the other multitasking queens out there, I see you, I am you, right? The more we can practice doing one thing at a time, focusing on one thing in front of us, we will see more willpower. I think it's why too, like even on that one, why people who maybe choose one word or one thing for the year versus having like a laundry list of New Year's resolutions. You know what I mean? If we even try to like put that kind of thing of like multitasking or having too many things to think about or focus on into perspective. And then also, Stacy, to your point of how many times we've been told to eat less, right? Low blood sugar depletes our willpower so fast. And the interesting thing about it is that when we have low blood sugar, when we are in that place of no willpower, what that ends up looking like is seeking out safety, seeking out maintaining the status quo, avoiding risk. So it is no wonder that when we have low blood sugar, when every time we've been told to eat less, move more, and then before we even realize it, we're like deep in whatever that childhood comfort food is. Like, yeah, of course we are, right? One of my favorite studies on this, they looked at prisoners who were up for parole. So the prisoners who appeared in court in the morning or right after lunch received parole 65 to 70% of the time. Prisoners who appeared before the judge just before lunch, when they were hungry and had low blood sugar, or towards the end of the day, they received parole less than 10% of the time. And that is directly connected to the judge being risk averse, trying to maintain the status quo, and we're not willing to give someone the benefit of the doubt.
Ugh, that's heartbreaking. That's gut-wrenching. Hefty example that goes well beyond food and impact of life, and I think that's a really good example of one of the questions that I always like to ask, which is like, how do we consider ACE traumas, adverse childhood
Yep.
event
Events.
traumas, as they relate to something like what we're talking about, whether it's intuitive eating or simply like however you define this idea of focusing on making the choices that are for your nourishment, for nutrient sufficiency, however you're going to define that in a non-diet culture way, right? And it could be salad with a side of fries. Like I have intentionally made that choice multiple times before because I'm like, I really am craving roughage. My body wants the vitamins and minerals, and fries sound really good, and I'm not going to deprive myself of that. But I know that I won't actually feel good if I just eat like fries and wings or whatever, right? And
Yeah.
so there are it is harder and harder to make that choice and to have that conversation with yourself, whether it's related to willpower or not, if you have trauma in the body, because you literally can't listen to your body. You shut yourself off from your physical connection if you've had ACE traumas or these poor inmates who are seeking parole, right? I'm thinking of them and the hardship that they've lived through, like wherever you might be in your life and the hardships that you faced, it's harder and harder to do the things that we're talking about as it relates to willpower, so to speak. So I'm wondering how you would suggest incorporating these kinds of concepts for people who, and a lot of our listeners, if you haven't listened to the East Trauma Show, I'll put a link in the show notes. I highly recommend that you listen because a lot of us have them and don't realize. Like, if your parents got divorced when you were younger, like there's things where you're like, I didn't even realize that was leading to this ACE trauma calculation, which the outcomes are very, very much towards negative health outcomes as it relates to like higher incidence of heart attack and different kinds of things that it's really good to be aware of and to kind of like incorporate into your life and your wellness choices because it really has a strong impact on your long-term health. But that said, for you, Jen, how do the decisions that people can make today, do you think, can play into getting over some of that as it relates to willpower specifically?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say something about the trauma piece. Like for everybody listening, trauma is not about the event that happened. It's about how we respond or process what happened. So something like stubbing your toe could end up, like we think of it as something so insignificant, but the body can hold on to that in a very significant way.
Especially
So
if
like,
you didn't
yeah,
receive the validation from your parents
right,
that like, yo, gosh, I'm so sorry. Like, and also, since we're expanding on this, you were mentioning earlier with the vagus nerve, it's directly related to that as well with the brain
correct.
jet axis. And so that's where it becomes this thing that isn't just about willpower. It is literally in your body in a way that unless you're getting therapeutic services, unless you're really digging into what these things are and how they're affecting you, can have impacts that you're not even realizing are affecting your life, specifically, oftentimes with food.
Exactly. So when it comes to what we understand physiologically about willpower and putting it into practice, I'll go through a bunch of the things that we can do to replenish that willpower. But with that said, what we see in all the research is that the people who use willpower most effectively use willpower to create habits because the habits become automatic and over time no longer require willpower. And then we have stuff left in the cup for the situations that actually require it. So it makes me think of like Steve Jobs and Barack Obama and the people who like wore the same thing every day to minimize the number of decisions they were making. Like that is a physiological way, right, in practical daily life to minimize the number of things that are drinking from that willpower cup. Because yes, deciding what you want to wear drinks from that cup too. So glucose, managing our blood sugar by choosing quality fuel, protein, fiber, quality fat, and fueling regularly enough to avoid the extremes in our blood sugar allows us to keep our wits about us, allows us to have some patience, allows us to have some willpower, right? Part of why we crave sweets is that desire to sort of like fill the cup. It's fast fuel, right? We want to get our blood sugar back up when it's low. So one of the things that I teach everybody I work with and all my podcast listeners, so if this resonates for you and you like this, feel free to take it. Protein and fiber at every meal makes your moving fat no big deal. But it's really about how we fuel anytime we fuel. Protein is clean, lean protein, whatever you want that to be. Fiber is vegetables and sometimes fruit. Eat what you like, don't eat what you don't like. And a meal there's no real difference between a meal and a snack. The only difference is how much how much food we have at a time, and then therefore how long it's going to last us until we need to fuel again. Right? And then the other thing that you want a couple times a day is some quality fat. Like we talked about those omega-3s, And one day I will figure out how to get the fats into the cute little sentence that rhymes. But for now, protein, fiber, quality fat. Okay, other things that refill that willpower cup. Movement and exercise. Deep breathing, using our muscles, can replenish our mental resources, can replenish our physical stamina. And that's so counterintuitive because we often think like, I've got nothing left. Why am I going to use that for movement? And what we see in practical life every day with myself and my clients and what we see in the research is that it actually replenishes all of those things that felt so depleted. And that doesn't mean that it has to be something extreme. Like it can literally be circling your couch for 10 minutes, like walking, movement, breathing. Accountability dramatically increases our willpower. Like I think of accountability as almost like changing the size of the cup of willpower, not just like refilling it. And it's why people talk about the role of a coach, the role of a gym buddy, the role of making a declaration on social media maybe or whatever, right? But so having a partner dramatically increases our willpower.
I would
And
go
then,
even further to say, write it down and for yourself, right? Like, even if you're not ready to do all the other things that you mentioned, Jen, like sometimes as an introvert, what I find successful is like, I just need to make the declaration to myself and I am able to be accountable to myself. But if you don't declare it, if you don't write it down, if you don't state it, if you don't put it on a post-it note on your mirror, or like whatever that is for you, then you're not actually committing to whatever the thing is. And at the same time, if you write it down, if you have accountability, whether it's with a coach or a buddy or yourself, and you break that in some way, it is not a moral failing. We've talked about all the reasons that it's not, but I like to remind people because I feel like if they're not set up for success and they experience some sort of failure, that resiliency is like the flip side of willpower, right? And you only have so much of that as well. And so you're like, you know what? I'm not going to expend this on this thing that was supposed to make me feel good. And now I feel worse. It's okay to have blips along the way. Nobody is perfect. Lots of us are ordering fries with our salads.
right. Well, I think there's a distinction between accountability and perfection,
Yes. Good. Yes.
right? For all of us. And that's maybe one of the reasons for the outside perspective, because we're all harder on ourselves than we are on other people. And so, especially if you're the kind of person whose tendency is to beat yourself up, then 1,000% have somebody and a buddy with you in this so that they can point out that it's not all or nothing. Progress matters and that a day or a challenge or whatever doesn't take all of that away. But similar to your point of like writing it down for yourself, another piece of that that you could do if you don't necessarily, even if you do, but like gamification. So it's why the apps that give us our streak, right? The number of days in a row, it's why they're so effective. So if you are somebody who wants to do this more on your own, consider that, right? That streak, the gamification of it can help increase our willpower, can help us do the things that we tell ourselves we want to do. Two of my favorites that a lot of people ignore. So one is distraction. So the classic study on this is the kids who were put in a room with a marshmallow in front of them, and they were told if they can wait out like the 10 minutes or whatever it was, they would get a second marshmallow and they could eat both. But if they ate the first marshmallow in the 10 minutes, they wouldn't get a second one, right? The kids who were able to wait out the 10 minutes distracted themselves. They played with their shoelaces. They looked around the room. They did a million things except stare at the marshmallow. So distraction can help us. I think there's times where distraction might not be helpful, but this is one, like if you're feeling particularly challenged, maybe this is a tool to keep in your back pocket. And then the other one that I love, so remember how we talked about the judges and this idea of like maintaining status quo and self-protection. And it's all about the me in that scenario, right? One of the ways that we can increase our willpower is selflessness, charity, and generosity. Even holding the door for the person behind you. Maybe you pay for somebody else's coffee. Maybe you pause and compliment someone. But it's incredibly powerful in the physiological signal that it sends to the body if we can get out of ourselves and focus on someone else. So charity and generosity are linked to self-control because that self-control is actually what's needed to overcome that innate animal selfishness.
I love all of that. It's so funny. It's listeners who are longtime listeners are going to hear you talking and be like, did Stacy give you the outline and tell you all the things to say? Because even when it comes to like, I don't say should, right? And all of the things that you're mentioning there, they're all things that I encourage. And I talk a lot about charity and the Harvard Happiness Study and things like that. So love that it came back around to all of that. I do like to leave listeners with something positive and actionable that they can take forward to be of service, either to work on themselves or to help somebody else. In our case today, we've talked about a lot of different things. And I don't want any listener to think, I need to create this list of nutrient deficiencies. I need to like create habits. I need to do this. I need to do that. Because as we've mentioned, it's the thing in front of you and one thing at a time that will set you up for success, that will put you on a snowball of goodness, I like to say. And if you
Exactly.
try to do all the things at once, you're going to feel like a failure instead of set yourself up for success. So, what is what is something, maybe two things, but really just very simple, if someone was listening in the car today and the show ends, what would you want them to do to go forward and do with the rest of their day?
So many things are going through my mind. And the reason why I'm challenged by this answer is that the thing that helps today, so maybe this is the one thing. Recognize that the thing that helps today, improve our willpower, put us in a better mood, may not be the same thing that helps tomorrow. You could do the exact same thing another day and it doesn't do the trick. So we don't need to do everything. We need to be committed to trying something. And I use the word trying in a committed way because I generally dislike that word too. But put something on for size, give it a shot, and maybe the next day, give something else a shot. And build a bit of a tool belt so that we have different tools that we can pull out in any situation, because there are times where the walk isn't going to cut it. And that's okay. It means we need another tool from the tool belt. So that would be one thing. But I will say, to give you an action thing, one of the biggest game changers in my life over the last year is first thing in the morning, starting my day with 30 grams of protein. And yes, I use a protein powder. It is whey protein isolate. It has some creatine and branched chain amino acid. And starting my day with that highly bioavailable, bioactive protein has been a complete game changer for my mood and my energy and the trajectory of my entire day. And it's become the thing that's now autopilot.
Yeah. And
right?
I do think that we're a little bit of like two branches of the same tree, because I changed my trajectory by actually post COVID. I had long COVID and also it like kickstarted perimenopause for me. I was having a ton of hair loss and a ton of like negative health things. and I could not get a handle on it. Like, and I have done the tweaking of the tweaking of the tweaking on this health stuff for so much, and it was driving me nuts. And so I said, the one thing that I do not have control over is my cortisol. My cortisol is off the mark of all the hormones we talked about today. We didn't mention that. So I do want to like mention to people that none of this does any good if you don't have your cortisol in order, because when your cortisol is high, it prevents all the other systems and organs and everything from working properly. So for me, my
I was just
cortisol,
gonna say though, like everything we talked about also helps
yeah,
with that cortisol. So like I think the beauty of it all is like while there's a lot, it all works for all of it.
together. Yeah,
Yeah, it's like the things that you're gonna do for your mood are the same things that you're gonna do for your blood sugar and the same
right.
things you're gonna do for your stress and the same things you're gonna do for willpower. And like
The
that's
problem
incredibly exciting.
the problem that I had was I took it to that extreme that you were saying of, and if you take it to perfectionism, then you might as well be eating Oreos every day, all day, every day, in terms of how it will affect your health. It was affecting my health, how much of a perfection and obsession that I had over it. And so I said, as I mentioned, I was just doing like a coffee for breakfast, right? And I was like, the one choice that I'm going to make is I'm going to have a smoothie for breakfast within an hour, within 90 minutes of waking up. I'm going to have a smoothie. And I'm going to make sure that that smoothie has protein and fiber. And beyond that, I, anything else that follows that is like, great. That's the snowball of goodness, right? It's going to pick up from there. But the one thing that I'm going to hold myself accountable to is having this breakfast smoothie. And that breakfast smoothie led to so many other good choices. I gave up caffeine. I gave up alcohol. I got to bed earlier. I was able to regulate my cravings during the day because my blood sugar was balanced, right? Like all of these things. But if I had put all of those things on a list for myself, I could not have accomplished them. But it's interesting that like your answer is have a fiber rich, protein rich breakfast. And for me, that change was also like a huge catalyst that with making that change and quitting coffee, my cortisol became regulated within 3 months for the first time in my life. Like, I'm pretty sure my mother and I have Cushing's, but now, like, it's regulated because of the choices that I'm making. So I want to emphasize what you said and also encourage listeners to think about how that will work for you, right? Even though we're two branches of the same tree, we're doing it a little bit differently. I can't do whey, but I have found a solution that works for me. You found a solution that works for you, Jen. And I would encourage you listeners, if you want to know more about what Jen's doing and her different recommendations and things that you can check out Salad with a Side of Fries podcast. You can also go to a salad with a side of fries.com and you can follow Jen on Instagram at Jenn Trepeck on Instagram. We'll put all the links in the show notes for you, but I love that you kind of like brought that full circle for me in terms of our shocking alignment on some of this stuff. And also, I want to encourage people like it doesn't have to be a smoothie. If a smoothie is not for you, that's okay. You can do the same thing with soup. You can do the same thing with a breakfast salad. You can do the same thing if you want to make a breakfast burrito for yourself. Like, I'm not judging what this looks like for you. I know a lot of people love overnight oats and put protein in that. Like, it really is about making sure that you have that fiber and protein in the morning that I think was particularly impactful for my well-being. But also like,
And I want to jump in on that though, because I don't want to diminish the power of delaying. In your case, it was removing, but
mm,
the power of delaying the caffeine.
mm,
If we do caffeine with food or after and not before,
that
you
cortisol.
will also notice, exactly, you'll notice a dramatic difference in something that doesn't feel all that disruptive.
Yeah. And I think this is related to the challenges that you and I had. We mentioned the diet culture stuff earlier. It could be that this is not the challenge that you as a listener have. Maybe something else that we mentioned today hit home for you. And so the one thing that you're going to do is, something else. That's okay too. Like be accountable and know yourself and your body. I hope that The shows are always about empowerment and education, and for you to listen to what you need. And there are coaches, there are people like Jen that you can either work with or follow online to help you work through some of that stuff. But I think the key is to giving yourself the grace to recognize that this is not just about willpower. This is not a shame game of if you just did it better, harder, longer, whatever somebody's telling you is the reason, that's not the case at all.
Yeah, no, I 1,000% yes to everything you're saying. And I think no one, no one knows your body better than you. You are the expert. And anything we hear from anybody else, we want to evaluate within the framework of what we know to be true for ourselves. Full stop.
Absolutely. Mic drop. Gonna end it there. Listeners, if you enjoyed the show today, I want to encourage you to follow up and check out Jen. As I mentioned, we'll put all the links in the show notes for you. And it would be a huge help to me if you left a review for the show. Doesn't cost you anything but a few minutes of your time and helps listeners find the show and decide they want to watch it on whatever podcast app or platform you are listening or watching. It is much appreciated. And as always, appreciate your willingness to be open to growth, to listen, to learn, and through your own personal changes, because no one is perfect. But in doing that listening, learning, and unlearning, you can choose to become a better version of yourself for yourself. So thanks for being here this week, and I will be back next week for a new episode of The Whole View. Thank you, Jen, for being here.
Thank you, Stacy.